fellow Bear Lakers, and welcome. My name is Jody Burnett. It is my privilege to serve as the current president and chair of the board of Bear Lake Watch. As most of you know, historically we've gotten together every year to celebrate our shared love of this beautiful lake in one format or another. This year, we're trying something a little bit different, a virtual presentation that we hope you will find to be both informative and interesting. In order to provide you with an outline of that program, let me introduce our Executive Director, Lewis Chandler.
Well, good evening, and thank you, Jody, and many thanks to each of you for joining us this evening. It has been my privilege to rub shoulders with each of you over this past year with Bear Lake Watch. Your enthusiasm and your love for the lake is infectious. I'm excited to introduce this powerful lineup of speakers this evening. I'm going to use my cheat sheet here so that I make sure I don't get anything wrong. Each presentation has been custom tailored to this special audience. This audience of all of us who are interested in Bear Lake, the Bear Lake region, and watershed. First, we will hear from Teresa Wilhelmsen. Ms. Wilhelmsen is the Utah State Engineer and Director of the Utah Department of Natural Resources. She will be discussing water rights specific to Bear Lake and to the Bear River watershed, as well as give an overview of the State Division of Water Rights Strategic Plan. Teresa will be followed by Don Barnett, Engineer Manager of the Bear River Commission. Don will discuss what he has titled the Elevations of Bear Lake. This is a very detailed explanation of the elevations the lake experiences and why and when and how they are manipulated under tenets of the Bear River Compact to achieve maximum benefit for water users, from recreation to industry to agriculture. Next will be a very informative and interesting presentation by Jim Bocut. Jim is the Director of Conservation for the Division of the Utah Department of Agriculture and Food. Jim has prepared a very informative and eye-opening presentation regarding agricultural water optimization. In years of drought and even in years of surplus, water optimization is imperative, and Jim has some great insight to share and to consider. Jim will be followed by our very own Claudia Cottle, Bear Lake Watch Vice President of Government and External Affairs. Claudia will give us a legislative update and report specifically on some very exciting legislation that was run and passed in the Idaho legislature this year. This new law has special provisions for the benefit of Bear Lake. You'll be excited and interested to hear what has been accomplished. Rounding out the evening will be our own Phil Olson, Vice President of Bear Lake Watch Board of Trustees. Phil will close the evening with a final charge and call to action. There is so much that we want to share. We scheduled these presentations to keep this program at about an hour in length, but there is more. So as an addendum to this program, please keep watching as Don Barnett gives a very informative overview of the Bear River Commission and Bear River Compact. And stay with us further to watch an intriguing presentation from Jake Sirago, hydrologist for the Utah Division of Water Resources. Jake and the folks from the Water Resources Department have put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears into the problems we are facing with the shrinking of the Great Salt Lake. Jake will present the Great Salt Lake Integration Plan. You do not want to miss this presentation. The beauty of websites, YouTube, smart people much, much smarter than I, and technology is that we can make all of this available indefinitely and add to it as more information and topics become available. So keep watching our website for more details and more fun. Now, sit up on the edge of your seats, enjoy the evening as we all learn a little bit more about keeping our beautiful Bear Lake clean, deep, and blue. Thank you.
Good evening. I am Teresa Wilhelmsen, and I serve as Utah State Engineer and the Director of the Division of Water Rights. I would like to thank Dave and Claudia Cottle and also Lewis Chandler for inviting me to address the members of Bear Lake Watch tonight. I appreciate the work we have done in the past and look forward to our work ahead. In my role as State Engineer, I appreciate this great snow year. It brought temporary relief following 3 extremely hot and dry years. This year set a record for the highest statewide snow water equivalent in Utah. As spring arrived, we then worried about flooding, but Mother Nature seemed to cooperate by giving us a slow start to the summer. This year, many reservoirs will fill, however, many will not. This is a reminder that we still need to be wise in our use of our water supply. As you are aware, the Bear River watershed is located within 3 states. My role as Utah State Engineer falls within those areas of the Bear River watershed in Utah. The Bear River begins and ends in Utah, flowing through 4 Utah counties: Summit, Ridge, Cache, and Box Elder counties. I also serve as commissioner on the Bear River Commission, as do my counterparts, the State Engineer of Wyoming and the State Engineer of Idaho. I thought I would take this opportunity to discuss my role and responsibilities as Utah State Engineer and share with you some specific Utah water rights information. In Utah, the Office of the State Engineer is housed in the Division of Water Rights. As State Engineer, I am responsible for the general administrative supervision of the waters of the state of Utah. That includes the measurement, appropriation, apportionment, and distribution of those waters. My duties also include oversight of the state's dam safety program, the issuance of joint stream alteration permits, and the oversight of well drillers licensed in Utah. We maintain over 200,000 water rights and administer those rights by priority within the constraints of the available water supply. We have 7 regional offices across the state of Utah, with one of our regional offices located in Logan, Utah, that focuses directly on water rights in the Bear River watershed. In addition, we have 5 statewide sections. We have our applications and records section. They oversee all water right applications, title to water rights, and certificates issued on water rights. We have our adjudication section, which is the determination of the water rights. A very similar effort is going on in Idaho currently with the adjudication efforts in the Bear River drainage. We also have our field services section, which oversees the distribution, measurement and automation, enforcement, and well drilling. Another section is our technical services section, which oversees groundwater studies, water use reporting, mapping, and our database. Then finally, we have our dam safety section. They conduct annual dam inspections, oversee new construction, and issue the joint stream alteration permits. All decision-making authority in this agency is vested with the state engineer. The agency has no board. I am appointed by the governor and confirmed by the Senate for a 4-year term. Decisions are issued in the name of the state engineer and are not subject to superior agency review. A decision of the state engineer, however, may be brought to the state district courts for de novo review of the decision if desired. What is a water right? In Utah, all waters are property of the public. A water right gives someone the right to divert and beneficially use water. A water right will have a defined nature of beneficial use, a priority date, a defined quantity of water, a specified point of diversion and source of water, a specified place of use, ownership, and potentially storage, such as Bear Lake. Water rights are distributed by the state engineer according to priority. This slide demonstrates the larger water sources and storage reservoirs within the Bear River watershed in Utah. The headwaters of the Bear River are located in Summit County, Utah, in the high Uintas. Water is stored and diverted from the river for use in Utah, Wyoming, and Idaho as it makes its way to Bear Lake. From Bear Lake, the river flows through Idaho and back to Utah, where eventually it flows to the Bear River Migratory Bird Refuge and the Great Salt Lake. The 3 larger tributaries in Utah are the Malad River, Logan River, and Little Bear River. Some of the significant reservoirs in Utah also include Cutler Reservoir, Hiram Reservoir, Porcupine Reservoir, and of course Bear Lake. 3 main river systems in Utah contribute to the Great Salt Lake: the Jordan River, Weber River, and the Bear River systems. However, the Bear River system is the most significant. One of the biggest challenges facing Utah and the West is in addressing the declining levels of the Great Salt Lake. Over the last 2 years, the state of Utah has appropriated nearly $1 billion to enhance water conservation and water rights practices. Investment and focus has also increased to allow for additional measurement and modeling of our water use. In addition, Utah Governor Cox issued a proclamation suspending new appropriations of water within the Great Salt Lake Basin in Utah. The proclamation directs me to prepare a report to the governor and the Utah legislature by November 1st, examining the effectiveness of the proclamation and whether the proclamation should remain in place. Currently, we have held 4 public meetings in the areas affected by the proclamation to seek public input, 2 of which are within the Bear River drainage in Utah. Follow-up meetings will be scheduled later this summer to share additional information regarding the appropriation and use of water within Utah. We know we need to address the declining levels of the Great Salt Lake and have to ensure we don't institute measures that would have a negative impact on Bear Lake. Utah alone cannot solve the Great Salt Lake issue, and we look to our colleagues and all partners in the Great Salt Lake Basin to work together. As mentioned earlier, the Bear River is shared by 3 states with rights to divert and store water established under the laws of each state. As part of the Bear River Compact in 1958, the Bear River Commission was created, with each state having 3 commissioners, in addition to a federal commissioner appointed by the president to serve as the chairman of the commission. In my role as Utah State Engineer, I serve as the chair of the Utah delegation. With the participation of the 3 states, the Commission is able to carry out the provisions of the compact as we each manage the diversion and use of water in each of our states. As we look at the water supply within the Bear River Basin, the Bear River contributes about 50% of the natural flow to the Great Salt Lake. Focus for Utah on the Bear River has shifted from development to preservation of existing flows. New legislation this year appointed the state engineer as the chair of Utah's delegation to the Bear River Compact Commission. Bear Lake is a critical hub in the operation and management of the Bear River and the Great Salt Lake. As Utah State Engineer and Director of the Division of Water Rights, I feel it's important that the division have a strategic plan moving into the future. We are focusing on 5 areas that will help accelerate and improve our agency's abilities to work with users and manage water rights within the Bear River Basin. Those areas include more efficient application processing of water right applications within Utah, water right data enhancements, where we will bring more transparency to the water right records within Utah for everyone to be able to see and access those records. We are actively working to increase our measurement and automation device installations on water diversions within Utah and modeling those diversions within distribution and counting models. We're also focusing on groundwater management. In doing so, we are monitoring existing groundwater management plans and policies and actively identifying critical groundwater management areas within Utah and the Bear River Basin. We're also looking to accelerate our general water right adjudications to build and retain our staff and reduce backlog of objections. A lot of our work will also focus in the Bear River Basin and complement the efforts that Idaho is undertaking currently in their general adjudications as well. I believe that developing a strategic plan for the Division of Water Rights will really help us best serve the public and the water users within the Bear River Basin. During your meeting tonight, you have an agenda full of various water issues that affect the Bear River Basin and Bear Lake. I hope my presentation has been helpful to bring insight into my agency's work within the Bear River Basin in Utah and the shared work we have on the Bear River. I encourage you as members of Bear Lake Watch to continue to stay engaged in all of the conversations. I thank you for your time tonight and look forward to our continued work in managing a critical resource shared by all of us. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Don Barnett. I'm the engineer manager of the Bear River Commission, and it's great to be able to present to you at your annual meeting virtually and to provide you some insights and some information relative to Bear Lake. What I've been asked to talk to you about is what I term the elevations of Bear Lake, and to give you insight and understanding as to how various elevations are looked at and measured and their impact to Bear Lake and operations elsewhere on the Bear River system. And so I will present to you that information. This information presupposes that you have somewhat of a working knowledge of the Bear River Commission and the Bear River Compact, which information, if you don't have, can be found elsewhere. So a brief outline of the discussion is then to talk about the amount of, or the impacts to the elevations of Bear Lake that were found first in the original compact and then in the amended compact. Also discuss flood control operations, what we refer to as the equivalency procedures, the impact of the settlement agreement, and then also to look upstream a little bit about Woodruff Narrows Reservoir and operations and regulations which occur up there. So first of all, you need to know that when we talk about the elevations of Bear Lake, that we are talking about the elevation relative to what's referred to as the UPNL, or the Utah Power and Light datum. And there is actually a benchmark at the Lifton plant that identifies this datum or this elevation. We know that it's actually several feet different than the actual elevation. However, that's the elevation that was available at the time that the compact was entered into, and therefore all documents relative to the compact and water level measurements are associated with this datum. So if you're looking at elevations around Bear Lake, you need to make sure that you know which datum you're using as you're comparing and contrasting elevations. So with that understanding, let me just kind of give you then kind of a picture that says, as you well know, of course, Bear Lake is a natural lake that has existed for hundreds of thousands of years. And then on top of the Bear Lake has been added a reservoir. And the bottom of that reservoir is at an elevation of 5902. The top of the reservoir, or the full reservoir surface, is at 5923.65. And when full, then that amount of space contains about 1.4 million acre feet of water. Just above Bear Lake is the Mud Lake complex, and that's another water body that receives water and then exchanges water to and from Bear Lake. And in the original compact, there are words that say that Bear Lake means Bear Lake and Mud Lake. And so that has implications as to how we calculate or determine the elevation of Bear Lake, as I'll talk to you about in a moment. Then we have above Bear Lake other reservoirs which store water. And when the compact was entered into in 1958, it was recognized that there was existing more than 14,000 acre feet of original or pre-compact, storage that was occurring above Bear Lake. And then the original compact then granted the right to store an additional 36,500 acre feet above Bear Lake. And this storage was allocated with 1,000 acre feet to Idaho, and the remainder split equally between Utah and Wyoming. This storage is subordinated to other direct flow water rights within the Bear River system, but it is not subordinated to Bear Lake storage. And therefore this storage can occur regardless as to the elevation or the amount of water that's held within Bear Lake. When the compact was negotiated, this gave some concern to those that were worried about Bear Lake and the use of stored water out of Bear Lake. And so in the original compact, there's established what we refer to as the irrigation reserve. And what this means is that it's the elevation below which Bear Lake cannot be drafted, or water's released from Bear Lake strictly for power purposes, but rather it's the amount of water that's reserved for downstream irrigation use below Bear Lake. And the basis is that there were concerns by those who had the right to use storage water in Bear Lake that as additional water was stored above Bear Lake, it might become harder for there to be water stored in Bear Lake. And therefore, there was a schedule developed that identified that as upstream storage was created, that the irrigation reserve would go up, meaning that the elevation, which indicates how much water needs to be saved in Bear Lake, would increase, and thus the elevation would need to be higher before Pacific Corps is able to release water strictly for power purposes. Presently, of the original compact storage that's been allocated, there's a total of just over 30,000 acre feet that has been developed. And so based on the schedule, then the irrigation reserve is set at 30,000, or excuse me, at 30,000 acre feet, which corresponds to an elevation of 5914.61. And so that's then the irrigation reserve that's established at Bear Lake. You can see from this hydrograph of maximum and minimum Bear Lake levels that historically Utah Power and Light drafted Bear Lake fairly heavily for power purposes. The Bear River system at that time made up about 75% of all the power of Utah Power and Light. And so they would use Bear Lake as a reservoir and fairly severely draft the contents out of the reservoir. So once the compact came into place and an irrigation reserve was put in place, then Utah Power and Light no longer drafted the reservoir whenever it was below the elevation shown with the green dashed line strictly for power purposes. And so that's the irrigation reserve then that's established in Bear Lake. In the amended compact, there was then granted the right to store an additional 74,500 acre feet. This grant was granted with 4,500 acre feet to the state of Idaho, and then the remainder split equally between Utah and Wyoming. This additional storage is also subordinated to direct flow water rights within the system, but additionally, it's subordinated to the storage in Bear Lake, such that this additional storage, which was granted in the amended compact, can not occur when Bear Lake is below an elevation of 5911. And also, this additional storage cannot be used for purposes that would deplete the amount of water above Bear Lake by more than 28,000 acre feet. And so then that's the amended compact storage that was granted above Bear Lake. And so then it established another restriction level or key level in Bear Lake of 5911. Not that that elevation is a restriction on Bear Lake, but rather a protection to Bear Lake and a restriction on upstream storage. You also need to know that there are flood operations which occur in Bear Lake when Bear Lake is at higher elevations. In the early 1980s, Pacific Corps was sued several times because of flooding which occurred below Bear Lake. And the allegation was that there had not been left in Bear Lake sufficient capacity to store the flood flows, and so the waters have been passed on downstream. And therefore, Pacific Corps has established a target range that the lake should be to by March 31st. And so if there are waters in excess of their target elevation, which their median or normal that they're shooting for is an elevation of 5918. If there are waters in excess of that amount prior to March 31st, then the role is generally to release that water to create space in Bear Lake to accommodate the anticipated floodwaters that will come downstream. And so then that target elevation that has been established by Pacific Corps and agreed to by the Bear River states has been established and is used as another guide or tool in the operations of Bear Lake, is that target elevation. Of course, that only applies when Bear Lake is above those levels. Anytime that Bear Lake is above those levels, then Pacific Corps operates in a storage mode and puts all available waters into Bear Lake for storage. As I indicated to you at the start, the compact recognizes that Bear Lake and Mud Lake are to be treated as one and the same. And so the commission has adopted or developed a procedure where we look at equalizing the flow mathematically between Mud Lake and Bear Lake. And so waters that are artificially held higher in Mud Lake are mathematically released to Bear Lake to determine the elevation within Bear Lake. And so when we then speak of Bear Lake elevations relative to compact restrictions, we really speak of the equivalent elevation. And we have tables then that show the equivalent elevation. If we have a given elevation of water in Mud Lake and an elevation in Bear Lake, we can look at what the equivalent elevation would be in Bear Lake, and then use that in our regulation of upstream storage and for other matters. As you look at this table, you can also find the information on the commission's website on a daily basis. And so on this day that's shown here, you can see Bear Lake at the bottom had an elevation of 5911.98 feet. But based on the water that was held in Mud Lake on that day, the Bear Lake equivalent elevation was 5912.33. And we track that information as we perform various regulations of Bear Lake or upstream reservoirs. And so that information is available to you and is part of the regulation of the lake. Those of you involved in Bear Lake Watch, I'm sure, are familiar with the settlement agreement between the Bear Lake interest, the irrigation interest, and Pacific Corps that led to the ultimate settlement agreement, and then the restated and amended settlement agreement. And that agreement seeks to limit the release of water for irrigation purposes when Bear Lake drops below certain elevations. And it's done on a percentage basis. And so in the springtime, as Bear Lake begins to fill, the water levels are watched, and then based on the April 1st forecast, Pacific Corps estimates the maximum lake elevation for the year. And with that estimated lake maximum elevation, then within the settlement agreement, there's a table that then determines what the irrigation allocation will be. And that irrigation allocation starts at 100% when the lake is projected to be as high as the irrigation reserve at 5914.7, and then it begins to decrease as Bear Lake elevations decrease. And so each year then there's a meeting where Pacific Corps presents the projected Bear Lake elevations and then makes the storage allocations to the users based upon those percentages. So then that goes also into the calculus or the elevations at Bear Lake. And so in total, those are the various pieces that we look at as we administer Bear Lake or the Bear River system. One thing for you to be aware of is because of the interest, as you look upstream, the largest storage reservoir above Bear Lake is Woodruff Narrows Reservoir. It has a storage capacity of just over 57,000 acre feet. You can see the hydrograph of the Woodruff Narrows Reservoir over the years, and many years it fills, but there are also a number of years that it doesn't fill. And that's based upon water supply, but it's also based upon compact restrictions. Woodruff Narrows Reservoir, the first 18,000 acre feet, is stored under original compact storage allocations, which is not subject to Bear Lake, but the remaining 38,810 acre feet is subject to elevations at Bear Lake. And so in years when Bear Lake is below 5911 equivalent elevation, then the states get together and the commission determines the amount of storage which can occur and then restricts that storage based upon the contents in Bear Lake. So the amended compact storage is not active until Bear Lake exceeds an elevation of 5911. So just for you to know that that's occurring. So with those various pieces, that's the kind of the story on the elevations of Bear Lake and that are used in various compact and other water administration. I hope that's helpful to your understanding. And now if you can just answer the mystery of the Bear Lake monster, we'll have everything relative to Bear Lake figured out. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Jim Bokett. I'm the director of the Conservation Division here at the Utah Department of Agriculture and Food. And I have been asked to come and present today to talk a little bit about ag water optimization in the state of Utah, and specifically how it relates to you in the Bear Lake watershed and the Bear River watershed. And so this is similar to a presentation that I gave down in St. George, and hopefully you find this useful for you as well as I go through and present it. So just real quick, when you talk about water usage and you talk about water conservancy, you have to look at agriculture and the way that agriculture uses its water. So the slide that I've got here shows the water usage of agricultural and municipal water users throughout the state. And you can see that along the Wasatch Front, the majority of the water usage is municipal use. But if you look around the rest of the state, you can see that the majority of the usage here in the state of Utah is still agricultural. So on average, Utah diverts about 4.7 million acre feet of water per year, which is 2.9 million that is depleted or consumed. And that is essentially the amount that is utilized by agricultural producers is in the ballpark about 80% if you look at the entire state usage. And with that comes several misperceptions and a lot of scrutiny that falls upon the agricultural community of, are we doing enough to be able to conserve the water that's there? Or some of the debate that I've heard, which is surprising to me, is should we even be utilizing that 80% for agricultural production, or should we be moving it over to municipal water use? And I think many of us that are familiar with the agricultural community and the importance of the agricultural community understand that if we wish to be sustainable as a state, we've got to protect that ag land. We've got to continue to generate agricultural production. There are probably ways that we could do better, but large and in part, if we put a lot of our faith and a lot of our confidence in the supply chain and continue to get our food from, say, California or Mexico or the wheat belt, what happens when that supply chain breaks down? We need to make sure that we protect it. A couple things when we talk about agriculture and the importance of agriculture here in the state of Utah, we need to understand that agriculture accounts for a little over 211,000 jobs here in the state of Utah. 7 billion in direct wages are generated through those jobs. The direct output of the goods produced here in the state equates to a little over $27.9 billion as well. And this comes from a study that was recently conducted by the National Association of State Departments of Agriculture. Another thing, when we take a look at the amount of produce that's produced here in the state of Utah, I think a lot of people don't understand this as well. There was a study that was recently done by Utah State University looking at the food production just in the Great Salt Lake Basin here in the great state of Utah. You can see that in the Great Salt Lake Basin, there was over 118 million pounds of wheat flour that was produced in 1 year alone. Milk, 123 million gallons. Cheese, 106 million pounds. Beef, 66.3 million pounds. We've got egg production. We've got peaches, apples, onions, tomatoes, and the list could actually go on of the amount of produce that we have. So you can see that the amount of food that is produced here in the state of Utah is still fairly significant. Now, water users do have the highest rate of consumption, but a lot of things that people don't understand is they have the highest rate of consumption because they have the highest amount of water rights here in the state of Utah. It's not like they're going out and using water that belongs to someone else. In many instances, the water that they irrigate their land with is every bit as important, if not more important, than the land that they are growing that ground on. However, I will say this, that the agricultural community does realize that they are not the exception. They recognize that just like every other interest group in the state of Utah, whether it be municipal or private individuals, the ag community knows that they have a role to play in dealing with the state's water shortages. And in order for the agricultural community to continue to be sustainable, that they need to learn how to effectively utilize that water, especially when we're impacted by drought like we have been for the last 2 or 3 years. I've got a video that I want to play, and it's simply agricultural producers that are recognizing the situation that they're in and how us at the Department of Agriculture and Food has helped them do that.
Mother Nature is an extremely hard taskmaster, the hardest boss that anybody could ever have. There's no mercy. Probably half of my time is spent trying to use the water as efficiently as possible. You lose a few $100,000 year after year, you know, it's a tough go.
We've had more dry years than we've had wet years, and I think that's become the norm. The land is drier, the rangeland is drier, springs are that we could usually count on being there are drying up. So it's a scary time.
The department right now is in the process of working through our agricultural water optimization program. And this is a way that we can help farmers and ranchers use their water more efficiently. If the opportunity is presented, farmers and ranchers want to do better with the resources that they have.
They're reaching out to producers, they're reaching out to other individuals saying, hey, look, here's what we're up against, here's what we're facing. How can we overcome this? The Department of Ag is always there backing you up.
Change and conservation and best practices are changing and evolving, and I am very willing to evolve with them. With the help of UDAP and NRCS, we've been able to adapt those practices more quickly.
With the limited availability of water, by increasing the efficiency, even on these drought years, we may be able to farm nearly all of our acres. And so without some help from the state, I wouldn't be able to do this.
No one knows better than us the finite resources that we have here. So I don't think there's anyone that could care more about the land and its health and the balance than the people that are living on it and working on it. It's the lifeblood. We all understand what water is our lifeblood. We do our best to conserve it and to use it wisely, because without it, we're nothing.
So as the video pointed out, agricultural producers understand that they are in times that it calls for more innovative approaches. And one thing that we do at the Department of Agriculture and Food is take a look at the way that they're irrigating and try to find more effective ways for them to utilize their water, but be able to maintain or increase the crop yields that they've got. Now, all irrigation systems are not created equal. You've got surface irrigation, you've got wheel lines, hand lines, center pivots, drip systems, and a lot of it comes down to management. For example, surface irrigation, wild flood irrigation is probably the most inefficient method of irrigation that we have. But it's a method that a lot of people still use. Now you could use surface irrigation and do, say, a surge irrigation system where you push the water across in a timely manner and it's a laser level field, and that could be as efficient as 90%. The other thing that we need to look at in here is some of these systems can increase crop yield. Some of them can maintain crop yield. And the other thing is they don't all cost the same. So some of these water saving practices can reduce the water diversions by 15 to 20%. However, some of the improvements come at a cost of $5 per acre foot up to $25 per acre foot. And so these are the things that we look at with all of the producers. So our ag water optimization program has several goals and objectives. And the first is to reduce consumptive water use while maintaining or improving agricultural production and profitability, and providing increased operational flexibility for agricultural water users moving forward. The other thing that is a really interesting part about this program that is going to be beneficial moving forward is it helps landowners quantify the amount of water that they're using accurate real-time measurement devices. One of the requirements that we have is that they install a measurement device with their project so that they have a feel for what they're using. The other thing is we want them to document the availability of water before and after the implementation of the projects. And it also helps improve and protect surface and groundwater quality by reducing the overwatering of crops as well. So the Ag Water Optimization Program, we accept one application per application period. We have a maximum award of $500,000. It's a 50-50 match. We expect the landowner put in at least 10%. So if they go in and get matched from another entity, say the NRCS or something like that, we still expect the landowner to go in and pay 10% of the total project. We don't allow for in guns or big guns because they are proven to be very inefficient as far as water savings go. It has to be brand new material. It can't be old or used material that they have on their farm. It is reimbursement based, and so they go in, they install the project, and we then go and work with them to receive reimbursement for the project that they install. We do hold on to 20% of the project until the project completely finished and the measurement devices are installed on their operation. Once again, the requirements, we do expect them to have a real-time water meter. The implementation also requires that they develop an irrigation water management plan. Like I said before, a lot of the irrigation efficiency that you get has to do with the management of the system that you have. Currently, we are required to do a nutrient loading reduction, and this is something simple, just a spreadsheet to be able to show the water quality benefits or potential water quality benefits of the project. And we do request an annual report that includes irrigation season, the water that they've used, the irrigated acres that they've got, the crops irrigated, and crop yields as well. So we have been accepting applications since FY 2019. And so I just wanted to show you real quickly throughout the state of Utah, the number of projects that we've got. So since the program began in 2019, we've received over 786 applications totaling over $136 million. And so the demand for the Ag Water Optimization program continues to grow. And we were fortunate that we received $70 million last year in the legislative session, an additional $200 million in the legislative session this year to be able to go towards ag water optimization projects. We have funded effectively to date 276 applications, but you can see that we recently accepted applications for this spring. We're ranking those applications right now, and we're hoping to be able to have those announced by the end of June. The number of acres that have been impacted throughout the state right now through this program is around 775,000, and the projected water savings that we have is 172,000 acre feet. That's pretty significant when you look at the amount of water storage, say in Deer Creek Reservoir or Echo Reservoir. It would be the equivalent of filling up those two reservoirs. And to date, in Box Elder, Cache, and Rich County, so the Bear River watershed, we have statewide funded 279 applications. Of those, 114 of them were within the Bear River watershed. So a pretty significant amount are being funded within the Bear River watershed. Like I said, we recently accepted applications for the spring 2023, and out of the applications that we got 90 more applications in the Bear River watershed alone. So we are putting quite a bit of money on the Bear River watershed, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that we're hoping to be able to lead more water in the system that is going to get to the Great Salt Lake. But we also recognize the importance of preserving that water and leaving it in stream for the beneficial uses that are there as well. Just a real quick glance of the projects that we funded around the state. You can see that a good chunk of them have been up in northern Utah, but we've also funded a pretty high amount of projects in the Roosevelt area, so the basin out there, and then a lot that have scattered throughout southern Utah as well. So there's a pretty even distribution of the projects that we funded around the state. Just a real quick glance of the projects that we've funded over the last few funding cycles in the Bear River watershed. Once again, the bulk of them are in Box Elder and Cache County. We have funded a few in Rich County. I was looking at the numbers before I gave this presentation. It looks like we've got 9 more applications up in Rich County. Many of those are in the Randolph, Woodruff area, but we're hoping to see a few more projects as well around the Bear Lake area as well. If you have a producer that is interested in applying for the Ag Water Optimization Program, we do have another application period that's planned for the fall of 2023. We selected the new Ag Water Optimization Committee, which is going to probably put a new twist on ag water optimization and what we're focusing on in the program. And they will probably have some feedback on what the requirements will be for the application period in 2023. Anytime an individual goes and applies for ag water optimization funding, I make sure that they are assigned a planner from the Department of Agriculture and Food, just to make sure that the communication is in line, that they understand the application process. So in all reality, once again, the ag community, we haven't turned a blind eye to this. We haven't just taken a look at it and said, well, when it comes to water savings, you're on your own. The ag community is just going to keep doing what they're doing. They are looking at innovative approaches. They are going in and they're implementing these practices. And 50% of their own money is going towards these projects that are being installed. And so they do have a stake in the game, and they understand the importance of water savings. And us at the Department of Agriculture and Food are helping them and assisting them with the funding that we've received from the legislature. If anyone has any questions about the Ag Water Optimization Program or anything that I've talked about in this presentation, please feel free to contact me. You've got my contact information up here on the presentation, and I'm happy to discuss it with you. Thank you very much, and I appreciate your time, and I hope that this was a useful presentation for you.
Hello, Bear Lakers. This is David and Claudia Cottle, bringing you this message from the Capitol in Boise, Idaho. We're doing this to emphasize a great achievement for Bear Lake and Bear Lake Watch that occurred this year. Because of our new alignment and leadership and bringing on a new executive director, this has allowed David and I to devote our full attention to some more important steps towards preserving and protecting the lake. We call it 2 states and 1 goal. Why do we call it that? Well, as the young states of Utah and Idaho evolved, there were only a few people and there were lots of resources and seemed more than enough to go around. So the laws that were created were all focused on uses and how to systematically and fairly use the resources so the states in the region could grow and prosper. Well, we did that all right. Now there's a lot of us and fewer, it seems, natural resources to go around. As we've worked as Bear Lake Watch toward making sure that Bear Lake is preserved and it's not destroyed by man's uses, we were amazed to find that there are no laws that say that we should preserve Bear Lake. Shocking to me to find out that there is no directive and it's no one's job to preserve Bear Lake. Each of the agencies has their own mission, their own things that they're to accomplish, but that isn't necessarily to preserve Bear Lake. It might be take care of the lands, the fishes, water quality, and so on. But none have been given the job of preserving Bear Lake. It's not in the law, and it's just not their job. Well, this was quite surprising to us, but it made us realize that if anything was going to happen, it had to be put into law. Otherwise, it's just a wish. It's just a pipe dream. So we set our sights on the 2 states and 1 goal, starting out in 2019 by passing mirrored resolution in Utah and in Idaho, a joint memorial that pointed out these issues and the need for the joint expectations between the 2 states. But that's still just a wish. It's not in the law. Things slowed down a bit with COVID and now the crisis of the Great Salt Lake. But we're determined not to be stopped. So last year, we began the process of legislation with our senators. Years of building relationships and partnership, working together with the Bear Lake Settlement Agreement, have paid off in support from our friends and partners on the river. Even then, it wasn't easy. You still had to find the right words, put them into a draft, red lines, blue lines, a new draft, back to make sure it said everything that everybody could support. But we got it done. It was carried unanimously in the Senate and the House in Idaho, and signed March 29th by Governor Brad Little. Notably, it becomes the law of the land this Saturday, July 1st. This is a great day and a great time for Bear Lake and an opening to new avenues in governance. So what did it say? A few simple concepts. First of all, it recognizes that Bear Lake was a natural lake at statehood, and that it's still in its basic natural form and function, and it has those desirable characteristics that everyone values. It also describes these as desirable. The bill also points out that it's been used for power generation and irrigation for over 100 years, and that it makes clear that no water rights are hindered or interfered with as well. And because of this duality of both meeting man's needs and nature's needs, makes it more difficult, and therefore encourages the state agencies and stakeholders to collaborate and work toward the preservation of Bear Lake for future legislatures and administrators, so they don't have to go back and analyze this situation again. It's there in our code. It's the wishes of the state, and unless there's some good reason to change the law, it should be there. Don't take this as bragging, because we couldn't have done it by ourselves. We couldn't have done it without our partners of the power company and the irrigators in support. We couldn't have done it without Senator Harrods and his tutelage and help and persistence to help us build the support for it, and to many others who help us navigate the hoops and processes of legislation. We just couldn't have done it without so many people, and we say thank you so much. But remember, we said 2 states. That's 1. And there's 1 more to go.
Welcome to Utah.
So now we're back in Utah, and luckily, not really at mile marker 0. While many were bogged down with issues of the Great Salt Lake, our Senator Chris Wilson was able to find funding for a study that will and is going on to analyze these same problems, to see where we can better match government with the desires for preservation of our resources. We're very grateful to him for this, and we will be back. Now we have the language all figured out that's acceptable to the partners. We'll get this legislation through in Utah with your help. We're grateful for your support through all of the years, and we're proud to be Bear Lakers and stand shoulder to shoulder with you for the preservation of Bear Lake. Again, thank you.
Hello, my name is Phil Olson. I'm Vice President of Bear Lake Watch, and I'm a longtime Bear Laker. It's truly hard for me to imagine that this is my 75th summer at Bear Lake. For starters, I want to thank our Executive Director, Lewis Chandler, for all his efforts to organize and coordinate this first ever virtual annual meeting for Bear Lake Watch. I also want to thank each of the presenters for their insights and for their efforts on behalf of Bear Lake. Next, I want to thank all of you who are watching. The simple fact that you are taking the time to learn about the efforts of Bear Lake Watch is an indication of the fact that you truly do care. For more than 100 years now, the Olson family has been enjoying Bear Lake. My mother was born in Star Valley, Wyoming back in 1913. As a child, she fell in love with the lake during the summers when she came here with her family in a horse-drawn buckboard. After receiving a teaching credential from Utah State University in 1937, her first teaching position was at Bear Lake in a one-room schoolhouse located in Garden City, Utah. After she got married and started having a family of her own, she made sure that each of her 9 children were properly introduced to the lake. And her legacy at the lake continues with summertime adventures for me, with my parents, brothers, sisters, and friends, as a Boy Scout counselor at Camp Hunt, as a groundskeeper at the USU Fish Lab in Pickleville, as I got married and as my wife and I had children, and continuing on as our friends visited and as our grandchildren were born. All along the way, we've tried to make sure that each person got the opportunity to fall in love with Bear Lake the same way that we did. I'm hoping that your Bear Lake story is similar to ours. Whether your family has been coming to the lake for 100 years or more, or whether your family legacy at the lake is just now beginning. One thing is certain for all of us and for the generations that are to come, the serious importance of taking care of this magnificently beautiful lake. It's essential for you to know that Bear Lake Watch exists to serve as an advocate on behalf of Bear Lake through its active participation wherever issues related to the lake are being discussed and being considered. Bear Lake Watch truly represents Bear Lake, and we represent all those who love and care about keeping the lake clean, deep, and blue. Our mission is to protect and preserve Bear Lake by advocating for the responsible management and use of its resources. Our actions include serving as the evidence-based advocate solely dedicated to the protection and preservation of Bear Lake. Engaging with all stakeholders and decision makers in discussions, in negotiations, and actions related to the enhancement, protection, and preservation of the lake. Supporting and helping to fund research that focuses on the collection, evaluation, distribution, and utilization of accurate scientific data related to Bear Lake and its ecosystem. Educating and empowering key decision makers and the general public by providing them with evidence-based information related to Bear Lake. And of course, raising funds and gaining public support for the mission and vision of Bear Lake Watch. It's through the generosity of donors like you that Bear Lake Watch has raised more than $700,000 in recent years. And we've leveraged that amount into more than $1.2 million of research projects on and around the lake. I encourage you to go to our website at bearlakewatch.com to learn more about what Bear Lake Watch is doing with the funds that we receive to help keep Bear Lake clean, deep, and blue, both for current and for future generations. But you know, Bear Lake Watch couldn't do what we do without the generous support of special friends like you. In that spirit, I invite you to demonstrate your support for the work of Bear Lake Watch by making a generous contribution to this most worthwhile cause. Go to our website, bearlakewatch.com, to make your generous gift. Or you can make a gift on your phone right now by texting Bear Lake to 44321. Texting Bear Lake to 44321. Or here's a third option. You can mail a check to Bear Lake Watch, P.O. Box 205, St. Charles, Idaho, 83272. Bear Lake Watch, P.O. Box 205, St. Charles, Idaho, 83272. On behalf of Bear Lake Watch, I want to thank you for your support. We look forward to seeing you sometime soon at Bear Lake.
Hello, everyone. My name is Don Barnett. I'm the engineer manager of the Bear River Commission, and I've been asked to provide a brief overview of the Bear River Commission and the Bear River Compact. As I run through this discussion, several items that I'll be hitting on is an overview of the compact, major provisions of the compact, as well as the amended compact, a discussion about the Bear River Commission, and then just a brief understanding of the hydrology of the Bear River system. So first, jumping into the need for the Bear River Compact. The Bear River originates in the Uinta Mountains in Utah. It flows then generally northerly into Wyoming, then back into Utah, then back into Wyoming, where it turns northwesterly, flows into Idaho, and then after flowing through Idaho, it makes a very abrupt turn and heads south, goes back into Utah, where ultimately it discharges to the Great Salt Lake. In total, the river travels about 500 miles and yet ends up only 90 miles from where it originated. It, in that travel, crosses state lines 5 times, thereby effectively dividing the river into 6 different state sections on its course. It's interesting to note that John Wesley Powell, in his exploration of the arid West, identified the various drainage basins within the West and suggested that potentially the United States determined to divide up state boundaries not upon specific lines that correspond to geographical areas, but rather to do it based on watersheds. And it would be interesting if you were to find that you were, instead of being from Idaho, Utah, or Wyoming, that you were from the state of Bear Lake. His thoughts were that it would help in water development, it would help in times of drought, and it would help to reduce conflict. But nonetheless, we have the state boundaries as they are, and therefore there's a need for the states to work together in determining how this very valuable water resource is divided up amongst them. And the U.S. Constitution provides for how it is that states enter into agreements with each other. And it's through a compacting process. The Constitution provides that if the states want to enter into agreements with each other, or compacts with each other, that they are to do so only after they receive the consent of Congress to enter into compacts. The process of creating, or with time amending compacts, is fairly involved. There's initially the beginning of study of the matters associated with the compact. In this instance, with the Bear River, there was nearly a decade of study or more that led to the ultimate signing of the compact. Then once the matter has been studied, when the states want to formally negotiate, they go to Congress and receive permission to enter into those negotiations. They then formally negotiate the compact. They then hold public hearings, and then ultimately, after any revisions, then the negotiators sign the compact in behalf of the states. After the compact has been then signed by the states, it then goes to the 3 state legislatures, as in the Bear River Compact is concerned, and the legislators then pass bills within each of the states, and then the legislation is passed on to the governors of the states, who then sign the compact into state law within Idaho, Utah, and Wyoming. The compact is then sent to the U.S. Congress, and after it passes the U.S. Congress, then it's ultimately signed by the President of the United States. And so a compact really becomes both state law as well as federal law. Some people have referred to it as super law, and it's a fairly involved process. In the instance of the Bear River Compact, there began discussions from the states informally a little bit in the 1930s, more formally in the 1940s, and then mostly more in earnest in the 1950s. They formed a legal committee, an engineering committee that really looked at all of the matters. They entered into a very large U.S. Geological Survey stream gauging program, and did a number of studies over a several-year period to look at options for compacting on the Bear River. And first, they needed data and information relative to the water supply and the water usage. Some of the matters that they were anxious about in the initiation of the discussions were, should the waters be divided based upon prior appropriation rules, i.e. strict priority basis distribution, or should they be more looking at equitable apportionment, looking at the use of water within the states, regardless as to when it was developed, and dividing it based upon that usage? Ultimately, they settled more on the latter, and that is that they decided to divide the waters of the Bear River based upon the acreage that had been developed at the time of the compact within the various sections within the states. There was also discussions relative to the grant of additional storage water above Bear Lake. This was a subject that was of concern to the downstream users in Idaho, as well as UPNL, who was receiving a significant portion of its then power supply from power plants along the Bear River below Bear Lake. And so those were some of the big ticket items that they were worried about in the study process. And I know you won't be able to see in detail, but they created a very large map of all irrigation uses in the Bear River system and mapped each of the ditches and canals, and then studied their water rights and created lists of water rights. They then looked to the irrigated fields within each of the states and measured the size of the irrigated fields and the amount of irrigation that was occurring, and tallied it all up and verified it on several different occasions as they did their various modeling of the potential distribution options of Bear River water. Ultimately, they arrived on a scenario that the best way to distribute the flow of the waters between the states would be to divide the Bear River into 3 different divisions, almost treat them as if they were separate rivers. And so they identified what is called the upper division, which goes from the headwaters down to Pixley Dam, which is upstream of Cokeville, Wyoming. And then the central division, which goes from Pixley Dam down to Stewart Dam, where waters are diverted into the Rainbow Canal and conveyed to Bear Lake. And then the lower division, which goes from Stewart Dam down to the mouth of the river where it discharges to the Great Salt Lake. So these were the divisions then that they divided the Bear River into. And then they identified the percent of diversion, or percent of water usage, based on acreage that occurs within each section within these divisions, at least for the upper division and the central division. And then they looked at the amount of water that is required to meet a full water supply for the irrigators within those divisions, and then identified that when the flow of the Bear River within those divisions is below that amount, then that the water would be distributed on an interstate basis rather than on a state basis, with allocations to each state section within the division. And so in the upper division, then that amount is 1,250 CFS, where if the flow is greater than 1,250 CFS, then there's sufficient water for all of the uses which were identified at the time of the compact. And if it's below this amount, then there's the declaration of what's termed a water emergency, and then distribution occurs according to the interstate percentages identified on the map. In the central division, they identified 2 triggers for a water emergency. The first is if the flow at the border gauge, where water flows in the Bear River from Wyoming to Utah, drops below 350 second feet, then a water emergency is triggered. Or if the total amount of water available for diversion in the central division is less than 870 CFS, then a water emergency is triggered, and then water is distributed on an interstate basis. In the lower division, because the water supplies were larger, at the time of the compact in 1958, they determined to not create a percentage distribution between the Idaho and Utah users, but rather to simply identify that should the flows drop to the point that a user in Utah is being shorted water because of diversions in Idaho, then that user in Utah can petition the commission and ask for distribution within the lower division without regard to the state line. And so those were some of the things that they wrestled with and decided to do. And so then they ultimately wrote it up and put it into the compact, which identifies that the purposes of the compact are really to remove the causes of present and future controversy within the Bear River system. I can tell you, having worked on a number of different interstate water systems, that the Bear River system, though it has issues from time to time, has functioned extremely well. And the states have been able to work together under the compact, even in very trying times with limited water supply or other issues that come up. The compact itself has got several articles. The first article identifies the purposes of the compact. The second defines a number of terms that are used in the compact and provides direction on the portions of the river that are included in various sections or various aspects of water allocation and distribution. The third article creates the Bear River Commission. The fourth then defines how water is distributed from a direct flow standpoint between the sections of the states. The Article 5 then allocates the storage water, and then there are various other articles with other items. The Bear River Commission, as created by Article 3, is to be composed of 9 commissioners, 3 each appointed by the governors within the 3 compacting states. The compact does not specify how the commissioners are to be appointed, but rather they're appointed according to state law. It also provides that there can be an additional or a 10th commissioner, if so appointed by the President of the United States, and that federal commissioner, if appointed, would then serve as chair, but without vote. And so that is then the composition of the Bear River Commission. Then each state then has a law specific to how their commissioners are appointed. In Wyoming, they use their general law relative to appointment to commissions. In Utah, there's a specific legislation that identifies that Utah's state engineer will be a commissioner and will be the chair of the Utah delegation, and that the other 2 commissioners shall be appointed by the Utah Board of Water Resources, and that one shall be an irrigator in the lower division and one an irrigator in the upper division. Idaho similarly identifies that the director of the Idaho Department of Water Resources may be a commissioner, and then that the other 2 commissioners are residents of Idaho within the Bear River watershed. The commission has bylaws. Those bylaws identify various things, including the organization, the functions, and the responsibility of 5 different standing committees, as well as meetings of the commission, notices of the commission, finances of the commission, and other matters. After the compact was first initiated in 1958, those first years were fairly tough. There were a number of places that didn't have measuring devices or regulating head gates. And so in those first several years, there was an awful lot of work that needed to be done to allow for the water to be distributed within each section and divided equitably between the states. To compound the issues, those first several years after the signing of the compact had flows that were much below normal, and therefore things were fairly tight in those initial years. And you can read about the distribution and the various matters that went into the compact in the Commission's annual reports that were published at that time. Shortly after the initial compact went into place, and with a little bit of experience in administering under the compact, there began to be discussions about the potential to amend the compact. The governors of the compacting states met and had initial discussions in 1967. And then those negotiations became more earnest in the 1970s, with the amended compact being signed by the President of the United States in 1980. Some of the matters that they were looking into were that they didn't want to create a race for development in the lower division, recognizing that they hadn't made allocations in the initial compact. They were anxious about allocating the waters in the lower division so that they didn't create issues between the states. There were concerns by some that there hadn't been allocated sufficient storage water above Bear Lake. They were also concerned about groundwater development and also looking at the distribution of water from a depletion standpoint. So those are some of the things that went into the discussions to the amended compact in 1980. Ultimately, when the amended compact came out, it added to the original compact then a recognition that all waters developed prior to 1976 in the lower division were recognized or grandfathered, It then allocated additional rights between Idaho and Utah. It also allocated additional storage above Bear Lake. But that storage above Bear Lake had a specific restriction that it could only be used when Bear Lake was above an elevation of 5911. And then it also identified that that storage would be restricted to uses that didn't deplete the waters more than 28,000 acre feet. Measurement of water usage within the Bear River system by depletion is a big deal. The states have specific procedures for identifying the depletions that are occurring in the Bear River system. And every 5 to 10 years, the states under their technical advisory committee analyze the water usage and estimate the depletions that are occurring within each section of the river. You can see that this table from the most recent depletion estimates show that none of the states are exceeding the amounts allocated by the compact. The information relative to the development of the compact and as well as the amended compact are preserved in a document that was created on the history of the Bear River Compact by the Commission's first engineer manager. And that document can be found on the Commission's website. You know, the law of the Bear River kind of composes a number of items. Obviously, it starts with the Bear River Compact, but it includes court decrees, it includes states' appropriated water rights, it includes the Bear Lake Settlement Agreement, it would include an agreement between the 3 compacting states and Pacific Corps as to operations of Bear Lake and other matters on the Bear River system. And so the law of the river that drives the day-to-day operations within the river are composed of a number of actions and documents. In the Bear River Compact, there's an interesting article, Article 19. It provides that the compact shall be reviewed by the states every 20 years, at least every 20 years, to see whether or not the compact ought to be amended. The compact has not been amended since the 1980 amended compact. However, both in 1997 and 20 years later, again in 2017, the Commission did examine the compact and went out for public input. And though ultimately found to not change the compact or amend the compact, did make changes in the Commission's bylaws and some of the practices and procedures in implementing water distribution and coordination between the states. One of the things that occurred is that the Records Committee was changed to the Records and Public Involvement Committee. And so since 1997, this committee has purposefully been more involved in participating in a number of public events up and down the Bear River system and trying to participate with water users and other interested parties and stakeholders within the Bear River system. The other thing that occurred in 1997 was that the Commission created a Water Quality Committee. This is the first time that the water quality leads from the 3 states had really come together and begun to interact and to share and to work together on water quality matters on the Bear River system. And over the years, this has been a very successful effort with the states coordinating and cooperating together on a number of efforts, including the monitoring of water quality, and most recently and currently in cooperating on the deployment of water quality platforms on Bear Lake, which are collecting a number of data for water quality parameters on Bear Lake. And so the Water Quality Committee has been an outcome of that 20-year review efforts that's been most helpful. One other item that I would note for you is that really the Bear River system, and this was instigated by the water users, has kind of let out in real-time water measuring efforts. And so you'll find in the Bear River system a significant number of the ditches and canals that are equipped with real-time monitoring stations. And so as you go up and down the Bear River system, you'll be able to see these stations. You'll be able to know the flows on the Bear River. If you go to the Commission's website and click on the real-time data tab, then you'll be able to view the river system in total, see the distribution of water and the flows past various gauges. And if you drill down deeper, then you can see the diversions into the canals as well as storage in the various reservoirs at any moment in time. So that's something fairly significant. Overall, in looking at the hydrology of the Bear River system, again, the river itself is about 500 miles long, yet ends only 90 miles from where it began. It's the largest river in North America that doesn't flow to an ocean. The annual water supply is estimated to be about 1.8 million acre feet, with an annual discharge to the Great Salt Lake of about 850,000 acre feet. And so that kind of provides you then hopefully an overview of the Bear River system, the Bear River Compact, and the Bear River Commission. Thank you.
Good morning, or afternoon, whatever time it is there. Wish I could be there in person. My name is Jake Sarago. I'm a hydrologist at the Utah Division of Water Resources. Grateful for this opportunity to present on the Great Salt Lake Basin Integrated Plan. Thank Lewis for inviting me to speak to you all today. This is a big, important effort at the Department of Natural Resources, and it involves a lot of stakeholders throughout the entire Great Salt Lake Basin. I'd like to start by showing this image, which is really neat. It shows the curvature of the earth, shows all of us living together in this big watershed. You can see Bear Lake there, just obscured slightly by the clouds. You can see Strawberry Reservoir, Utah Lake, and of course Great Salt Lake. So this kind of shows at a high level how connected we all are. I'm going to talk today about the need for developing a plan and some of the reasons why we're putting so much energy and resources into this. First is that water resources throughout the basin are stressed. People have a lot of you may have experienced this back in 2022. This year is different, but drought persists and life in the West persists. There's been multiple previous and current studies or plans that are very good in looking at a local system, but there's really no consensus on the story, in part because there hasn't been a study or plan at the level of the Great Salt Lake watershed. So farmers will say the current stresses on the lake or elsewhere are due to urban growth, and people in the city say, well, the real problem is people irrigating and farming. There's no consensus on data methods or even defining the problem. We really like to avoid impetuous decision making and making decisions without being properly informed. A plan provides vision for the future and the steps to how to turn that vision into a reality. And without that, we don't have the proper direction and can't be as proactive as we all would like to be. It's never been done at this scale, and the basin is very complex. So plans help with complex situations. So going into a bit about why the basin is complex, you can see this is a map that the Division of Water Resources provides for how water is used throughout the state. You can see urban areas are shown in red there, agricultural areas shown in green. The watershed boundary of the area that drains to Great Salt Lake is shown by the pink boundary. It's approximately 36,000 square miles and crosses 4 different states, 18 counties, 141 cities just in Utah, over 70 different groundwater aquifers, 1,300 reservoirs, and more than 150,000 different paper water rights. More than 2.6 million humans living here. It's projected to increase. Over 1.5 million acres of farmland, almost 700,000 acres are urbanized, 184,000 acres of wetlands, and then a whole mix of different behaviors, attitudes, and values. So this is a very complex area. And when we're looking at complexity, we have to ask questions about what happens with how we manage water and who's impacted and why. So one aspect of complexity with this situation has to do with time. And to describe this, I'm showing this graph of the elevation of the south arm of Great Salt Lake from the time the pioneers entered and started measuring up until the beginning of March. And you can see that what happened previously was the low elevation was in 1963, and from the time of the low up until the time of the highest elevation we've ever seen in 1986, about 22 years passed. From the high in 1986 down to the low that we measured at the end of October of last year, 36 years had passed. So the way I like to think about this is about what people tell me about retirement. I don't know much about that, but they say, Jake, you need to put a little away every year so that at the end of a career, you have good savings and you'll be able to you'll be able to retire from work. Well, I can't just retire tomorrow. I can't retire in 5 years. I can't even retire in 10 years probably. So similarly with something like Great Salt Lake, it really requires management of water getting to the lake over time. And that's really on display in the recent study done by the Great Salt Lake Strike Team, where they show these results. On the far left side, they have a target elevation for Gilbert Bay and Great Salt Lake. And then based on where it was at the minimum elevation, and they say how much water would you need each year for 5 years in order to fill it. And you can see that depending on how high you want the target elevation to be, more water is required. So interestingly, as you move across to fill it in 5, 10, or 20 years, then the amount decreases. So if we were to say that we want the target elevation to be 4198 feet, then if we want to fill it in 5 years, we need almost 3 million acre feet every year. But if we're willing to fill it in 20 years to hit that target, then we need just about 2.2 million acre feet, which is a really big difference. And then to maintain it, you need less water. So it's important just highlighting that the situation is complex, and the situation to properly manage water resources in this basin at the Great Salt Lake level requires a lot of time and therefore requires planning. And it requires working together with everybody who's involved, everyone who's impacted by decisions that are made, everyone who uses water, and people who care about it. So these are the partnerships, people who we've given this presentation to, who we've reached out and told them that we're working on this plan, and they've said we want to be a part of it. We want to do it, work on this plan together. Now, I realize Bear Lake Watch isn't in the environmental nonprofits group, but they're not listed here, but they are on our list. As I mentioned, there's been a number of studies that have already been accomplished. The Recommended State Water Strategy in 2017, Conservation Impact Study, recommendations stemming from HR 10 on how to get water to Great Salt Lake. Some of this was controversial, but a lot of it is very good information that can be used. The State Water Resources Plan in 2021, the Great Salt Lake Strike Team, fall of 2023, the USU Public Survey, and really countless others. So we're trying to bring all of this work together in one plan and build off of the work that's been done. So going into these are just a list of the types of studies that are out there and have been done in different watersheds. There are a lot of existing models. There's a model of the Provo River, the Strawberry Aqueduct Collection System, Utah Lake, of Jordan River, of the Salt Lake Water Supply System, of the Ogden, and Weaver Rivers of the Bear River, a model of Great Salt Lake for modeling water and salinity. There's a groundwater model, and we're working on also a hydrologic model for the entire basin. And this plan will put all of these parts together and allow us to better understand the system, to understand who gets impacted, and to understand how different types of strategies might be used to help build improved water management throughout the watershed, and ultimately at Great Salt Lake. So ultimately what we have is this plan which attempts to integrate existing work, existing knowledge. It attempts to integrate the management of and planning for surface water and groundwater, and it also attempts to integrate all of the different water users and groups who are impacted by water management. So the plan will do really these main things: define the problem in a clear and concise way, then go on to define hydrologic reality, so quantifying the amount of water that is available and the amount of water that's used, which includes water, how that water is used or needed in stream, in lakes and wetlands. And then we define potential future realities using state-of-the-art projections of what future supplies and future demands might be, and then analyze how the system responds to those different supplies and demands. Based on how the system responds, we identify options to achieve desired futures, and those options have become strategies or policies for how to handle where there are big gaps between supplies and demands. And then we develop a plan that water users can agree to implement. So I'm just gonna skip ahead a little to show this diagram where you see we have these blue clouds where we have stakeholders who possess expert knowledge that can provide these key indicators of what we need to look for to know what's important about water to each of them. Then we have public input, which is important because that influences policymakers, and that includes all of us. So we get public opinion, assess those values, and bring them in into the process. And then policymakers, ultimately, they make important decisions in terms of financing, regulations, management, and their goals are also important. So we bring all of this in together, and then we go through this process of using the modeling tools to see how these strategies will impact the goals and indicators. And then we have these trade-offs. So what do these trade-offs look at? Well, depending on what goals different stakeholders have, we can assess how a different policy would impact them. Whether it's you want to achieve a high population in a certain area, whether you want to use a large amount of water, or have a secure water supply. So I invite all of you to go to these links or social media, and you'll be able to follow updates on how we're progressing with the plan. You'll be able to answer questions that we provide periodically. You can provide input and comments. You can get notices of public meetings, and then we can take your comments and suggestions through this portal. Also invite you to check out the Great Salt Lake website. This is a great way to stay informed and see what's happening, especially with Great Salt Lake, but you can also contact us there, provide comments and suggestions. So lastly, I'll just go over the outcomes of what we're going to have. Most excitingly, we have a plan. There's not a plan for the Great Salt Lake Basin, and we'll have one by 2027. It provides perspective that everybody can understand, and hopefully provides realistic solutions. It will provide consensus on data. That's something that's objective. We should all be able to agree on that. That way we can have proper arguments on how water should be valued or used. And then the plan will provide tools, a centralized database, and some other analysis tools so that others can continue this work. We involve different strategies from different groups, and really trying to look at water resource solutions for all the water users. And it will involve a serious amount of organization and collaboration. To end, I really like this quote from the president of the University of Utah and Utah State University. This was included in the Great Salt Lake Strike Team report. They say, together with our partners in state government, we've joined in a model partnership to share with state policymakers the best available data and research on Great Salt Lake's declining water levels and the policy options that exist to reverse this trend. And this line is really what I want to highlight. This is Utah at its best, a state that collaborates, makes data-driven choices, and acts for the greater good. And that's really the spirit of Utahns, the spirit of working together, of collaborating, partnering, figuring out understanding the situation together, and then moving forward together for the greater good. So that's ultimately one of the main goals of this plan. So I thank you for your time and listening to me today. Please reach out to me if you have any questions or want to discuss anything about the plan. So thank you.